I have the honor of introducing our speaker today, who is Kabamishit Pineshikwe, whose English name is Sara Manville. She's one of my law partners and works with First Nations as a lawyer, strategic advisor, and negotiator. She has degrees from the University of Lethbridge, Queen's University, and the University of Toronto. Her master's thesis was on an Anishinaabe perspective of Treaty Number 3. Sara is from the Couchiching First Nation, which is in northwestern Ontario, and she has represented Couchiching as a lawyer, as a counselor in a First Nation government, and as chief, and has been active as a political leader in Grand Council Treaty 3 and in the Chiefs of Ontario organization. So, bonjour, Kabamishit Pineshikwe, ambe shagwa ikatun mina. And as is customary, I will offer you some tobacco.
You're a tall congregation. When I was a kid, I used to go to my mom's Roman Catholic church and hope to be able to read. I was an altar girl, and I didn't realize that the priest was doing really bad things to the boys, but left me alone because I was a girl. But I love to read, and it's funny how life comes full circle, where I'm here speaking with you today. Bonjour. Kabamishit Pineshikwe, Indigenous Makwa Dodem, Couchiching Nindoji. I'm grateful to be here in Anishinaabe Key, in land shared with many others through the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and to the Mississaugas of New Credit, settling their historic land claim here in Toronto. Toronto's a land of plenty, and those of us who share in this territory, we as residents, need to recognize the priority of place of Indigenous peoples who are not just here first, but who have a relationship that will last forever on these lands. We must honor that deep-rooted connection because it's sacred. There's a recipe of sustainability within the Creator's rules, and Indigenous people's place as stewards is integral to that plan. There are teachings that can be shared with you today. I try to live my life as a Treaty 3 person, recognizing that the main vision of our treaty was this: you would lend us your sons and daughters to learn all that is fine and good within Anishinaabe society, my society, and we would lend you our sons and daughters, and they would learn all that was fine and good in Canada. That's the treaty vision. My daughter's doing that right here in Toronto. She's going to school. I hope I'm upholding my part of the bargain as well. I respect this vision. I think it's an honorable vision, the reciprocity of relationship in our nation-to-nation interactions. My people have 7 grandfathers. These are teachings about how to live in Pamadzawin. Pamadzawin is the good path. Bimadzawin, the good life, achieving the good life. And Adzawin, the right way of doing things. To be Anishinaabe in all our life ways, these 7 grandfathers start with the principle of respect. The importance of trying to understand the Indigenous perspective of our shared history is important. Understanding our perspective of our shared lands. In 1873, my chief, Mawandapanis, taught the Queen's representatives this. He said, I want to talk about the rules that we had laid down before. It's 4 years back since we made these rules. The rules laid down are rules that we wish to follow. I do not wish that I should be required to say twice what I'm about to lay down. And they shared their beliefs that waters could be lent but not sold. Lands could be shared. He shared rules regarding specific matters such as Anishinaabe fisheries, the reciprocity of giving and taking, timber that was already reaping great benefit along the Rainy River, and how minerals were to be shared. Treaty 3 territories in northwestern Ontario, in Manitoba as well. It's Kenora, Dryden, Quetico, Sioux Lookout, Fort Frances. These are all here in Treaty 3 territory. Mawandapani's teachings in 1873 were forgotten. In 1885, a court reviewing Treaty 3, my treaty, asked themselves this rhetorically. Another point to be considered is, supposing the Indians had said to Treaty Commissioner Morris, we will not make treaty with you. If the appellant's contentions are correct, for all time to come, these vast territories would have been withdrawn from settlement. To maintain their position, the appellants must assume that the Indians have a regular form of government, whereas nothing is more clear, that they have no government, no organization, and cannot be regarded as a nation capable of holding land. This forgetting has consequences, not just for the Anishinaabe. I want to tell you a story that exists in Anishinaabe society to explain the importance of respecting relationships and remembering our commitments to one another. Long ago, in weeks where some animals were missing, not all the animals, but some of the four-legged, the hoof clan. Imagine the deer, the elk, the caribou, the moose, all gone. The Anishinaabe got up before the sun one morning, lit a sacred fire. They prayed, sang, and offered up their sema, the sacred tobacco. After a long discussion, where everyone spoke what was in their hearts, the people decided to send out the fastest runners out to the four directions to find their hoofed relatives. Some of the runners came back with indications that the hoof clan had disappeared. The final runner to return had gone the farthest to the most northern part of the land and had found one young deer. The deer explained to the runner that all of her relatives had left the territory forever because they were disrespected. As the people were told this sad news, they recalled how they had not shared the land. They remembered how they had wasted the gifts given by the hoof clan. They thought about the taking when they didn't have a need to take from the hoof clan. There was a lot of effort to make this right. Reconciliation is not simply saying, I'm sorry. Diplomats, spiritual leaders, so many advisors were consulted by the Anishinaabe. A lot of discussion, a lot of listening and learning. The effort was witnessed by the hoof clan, the concern and the priority given to their relationship. The assurances were not just talk, but it was to honor their places, their priority, and their lives. Moose, caribou, deer habitat was to become sacred. These are original promises. The reciprocity of the relationship was integral to the Anishinaabe. We cannot forget those sacred guarantees we gave as Anishinaabe to this clan. It's law, these special ceremonies that we have to undertake and continue to undertake. It's all about the importance of respect. Their beings continue to see the ceremony in that we continue to respect them and hold them in priority. It's also a little bit to do with your society's relationship with the truth. Of course, it's human nature to use forgetfulness as an excuse for dishonesty. Any of us with small children, we know that it's age-old game of the immature trying to get away with something. Honesty is the second teaching I want to share. It's very few rare instances in a court that you hear about the truth of treaties. And I just want to mention in the Kuwaitna, the Grassy Narrows decision at the Superior Court level, there's a room much like this that was covered in books and documents that the court had to learn about Treaty 3. That's a national exercise that's needed. The court said, or the judge wrote, for the purposes of this litigation, the plaintiffs are not claiming that they have ongoing Aboriginal title. However, it seems clear that before the treaty, the Ojibwe had Aboriginal title to all the Treaty 3 lands. Before the treaty was signed, the Treaty 3 Ojibwe exercised exclusive control over the Treaty 3 territory and exercised their harvesting rights. This is a truth that's not commonly known about Treaty 3. And it's the problem with our relationship with Canada in a nutshell. Treaties, we need to be honest about them. Every Attorney General in Canada should have a deep understanding of treaties. They should also have knowledge of the Indigenous perspective of these treaties. The treaties were with sovereign nations. My leadership said to the Queen's representatives, don't go talk to individual communities. We have a nation-to-nation relationship, and this was a common demand that was made by the Anishinaabe, by the Ogichita, the warriors. Talk to us as a nation, talk to our Grand Council, our national government. We had a Grand Council and a hereditary Grand Chief. It's called Ogichita, actually signed the Selkirk Treaty in the 19th century using his Bear Clan totem. And and the word Oguchida is next to it. This means warrior. In my nation, I also call this person Needham. Needham is actually the word that my daughter calls my partner, my wife, Tracy, calls her Needham because she's first in our family. Sovereignty is not a word in my language. The elders say Minagozawin. Minagozawin is what the Creator gave us. Those rules that Mawandapanis had mentioned in 1873. We need to be honest in Canada about unanswered questions in this relationship. How did Canada become sovereign? Is it truly sovereign? Why do so many Indigenous peoples like myself say that we're not Canadian? And is reconciliation truly the path forward in Canada? It's this false narrative that continues to be tied to the youth suicides in the North. A good friend of mine who's passed on, who worked in these communities for several decades, said that it's like the movie Groundhog Day. It's the same day over and over again. You can try to change the pattern, but it's deep, deep colonialism. All you can do is complain about it, but each day repeats itself, and you're helpless. And for the truly terrible things that can happen in that day, those repeated days are unbearable, beyond question. The next teaching I have is truth. Our truth lies in our treaty relationships. It ties us together. Mutual concern, mutual respect, mutual understanding. We have to see each other as very old friends. All I see in law is adversary. They're not my friends. They're my enemies. They're trying to defeat me. The Creator has given us rules that we should follow to govern us rightly. We tried to build that understanding in 1873. The national truth-telling, a national narrative that we understand now is the Indian residential school. These are painful truths. You see it in the reports of the April Wash Committee, additional truths. You see it in the historical records and the land claims across Ontario. Ontario has done a lot of bad things to First Nations and to treaty rights. There are several stories to be told about this relationship. And are we able to listen to more hurtful and painful stories any longer? Personally, I have a few stories to tell. I know relatives and friends who have stories that people should hear. But truth can be personal, and truth can be public. And it can be a narrative that we all agree is important for us all to remember. Residential schools is such a narrative. Treaties are also a narrative that we need to come to a common truth about in order for Canada to mature out of its colonial past. My treaty has a wonderful narrative because the Treaty Commissioner wrote a book. There is also a newspaper that was there called the Manitoban. And in our Oguchida, our leadership paid some people who could write in French to write down a record of the treaty discussions. The chief of Lac Seul said something like the following: "We are the first that were planted here. We would ask you to assist us in every kind of implement to use for our benefit, to enable us to perform our work, a little of everything and money. We would bore your cattle. We ask from you this support. I will find whereon to feed them. The waters from which you take your food for yourselves, we will lend you in return. If I should try to stop you, it's not in my power to do so. If you give what I ask, the time may come when I will lend you one of my daughters and one of your sons to live with us. In return, I will lend you one of my daughters and one of my sons for you to teach what is good, and after that, what is learned to teach us." So why aren't these important treaty narratives part of our common understanding of our relationships? Is it because there was not truthful, honest representatives representing your queen in 1873, 1764, 1905, 1982, or 2018? And that humility is the next teaching I want to share with you. In 1909, our Grand Council complained about being admonished for killing the cattle that was part of the treaty benefits. And the Anishinaabe wondered aloud, does the Queen expect our cattle to live forever? Racism has certainly seeped into our relationship. The racism underlying our relationship must be undone. The deep colonialism that's impacting our youth, our women, our men, everybody. This undoing is to be a project that should be a national priority for all of us. In the early parts of our treaty, up to 1890, there was actually benefits happening with treaties. In one account in 1890, there was an account that there was almost $10,000 worth of fur that was gathered by the Anishinaabe. They had 38 stables, 116 homes for under 500 people, quantities of fish, wild rice, meat from hunting and trapping to support themselves in times of scarcity, annuities of about $2,500, which was about a quarter of the trapping income, so it was useful. It wasn't a flourishing economy, but it wasn't a dependency that we witnessed since then. 1890 is an important year because that was the year that Mawandopnis had passed. The Fierce Gichita passed away in that year. In Treaty 3, there were many efforts to make an agreement between Canada and the Anishinaabe from 1869 to 1870 to 1871. But it was education, the promise of education, that brokered the final agreement, and a mutual aid through a lasting friendship. The education promise was broken almost at the beginning. Chief Mawandopnis was informed that First Nations would have to build a school before Canada would send teachers. The government did not deem it advisable to establish a school on reserve. Mawandopnis actually went to Winnipeg to speak to Alexander Morris and asked, "Show me on this parchment where it says that we have to build the schools." Canada's colonial policy was to allow missions to construct schools and provide teachers, which Canada would supplement with a grant. Chief Mawandopnis died without ever seeing a well-funded and efficient day school built on reserve. In fact, his reserve, my ancestors' reserve, was extinguished by Canada because of demands by Ontario. Ontario wanted the rich, fertile lands of the Rainy River, and so there were 6 First Nation reserves that were extinguished before 1915. The reserve I'm affiliated with now, Couchiching, is on the shores of Rainy Lake. It's flooded by a development of hydro on the Rainy River dam. We lost about a third of our reserve land, and that's just being reconciled through a land claim settlement this year. The flooding happened in the early 20th century. Humility is required by Canada to just stop acting unilaterally, and also for Ontario to understand that it definitely was instrumental in this painful past. We were under a policy of estrangement rather than friendship. Getting away from a life that we have little control over, this Groundhog Day scenario must end. And that only ends when we talk honestly, respectfully, courageously about treaties. The next teaching is about courage or bravery. When I was a land claim lawyer for my community, I came across a bunch of records of the history. And in 1929, the historical document came to my attention. I was actually doing my master's research, and Robert Janes, who was doing the Grassy Narrows case, actually utilized this document in the discussions with the Kuwaitan decision. And it's a letter written by a federal bureaucrat in witnessing what was happening under the treaty. And he was wondering why Ontario was getting away with this. He wrote, "I have seen many Indians practically starving on the shore, whilst they watched white men fishing commercially on the bays adjacent to the reserves. The Indians themselves being refused fishing licenses in Ontario, although quite willing to pay the license fee in purchasing their nets and equipment. Actually, in treaty, we do get fishing nets every year in order to practice fishing. But in those years, we didn't because Ontario had outlawed our treaty rights. This is in 1929, hard, difficult years for a lot of folks in that era. In the Anishinaabe, my people's perspective at Treaty 3, we were guaranteed our garden islands, our lands, our wild rice fields on the water, and that our reserve lands would be protected. There are many examples, many stark examples of Ontario's injustices. In 1938, a delegation of Anishinaabe from Treaty 3 went to Ottawa and said that the game wardens have to start seizing our nets and our boats, and we'll go to jail if we need to because our families will starve if we can't hunt and fish. And back to 1929, this is the bureaucrat's name is H.L. Bury, and he talks about the worst conditions of living that he's ever experienced. The Anishinaabe were prevented from hunting for food, restricted from commercial fishing. The blueberry crop had failed. They'll need the help and the assistance of Canada, financial help, but also the assurance from the department that their grievances will be remedied as far as humanly possible, and they'll turn to the future with renewed hope and conviction that treaties are inviolable documents, not susceptible to alteration or abrogation by parties who are not contributory signatories, like Ontario. There are many stories to be told, and it's the public narrative that we must learn and get right at every retelling of it. And that's the sixth teaching, wisdom. Treaty 3 involved is U.S. Indian law scholars call jurisgenesis, the creating of a great and binding law between two nations, a treaty federation. Before our treaty was made, before we created in 1869 a list of demands to make treaty with Canada, we had actually sent scouts to Montreal to see if we actually could to fight a war and defeat and keep our territory. Sadly, around 1865, the scouts came back and they said, no, we're unlikely to win a war against the British. So there was also a Dawson route that was agreed to. There was an agreement of a $3 annuity to the Anishinaabe for this Dawson route to come through our lands, because before you'd have to go through Minnesota to get to between Thunder Bay and what is now Winnipeg. So this Dawson route annuity was a grievance that was actually, you hear it complained about again and again in the treaty discussions in 1873. We didn't think that treaty was necessarily the best way forward, but at the end of the day, because of the education guarantee, we agreed to treaty. We drove a hard bargain. Simon Dawson in 1872 said this about my people: "They are sufficiently organized, numerous, and warlike to be dangerous if disposed to hostility. And standing as they do in the gateway to the territories of the Northwest, it is of the highest importance to cultivate amicable relationships with them." It was good policy to make a treaty on behalf of Canada. It's important to understand this as a nation. What does Treaty 3 mean for all of us? There's been sparks of wisdom about treaties and about the importance of constitutionally protected treaty rights. It's to secure for First Nations a modern unfolding of rights. This is Justice Lambert in the BC Court of Appeal. A modern unfolding of rights flowing from the fact that before settlers came, the Indians occupied the land, possessed its resources, used and enjoyed both the land and the resources through a social system. This is our laws. Mamandapanis talks about the rules that govern us rightly. The modern unfolding must come not only in legal rights, but more importantly in the reflection of those rights in the social organization and economic structure, which will permit the Indian people to manage their affairs with some independence from the remainder of Canadian society, and also with honorable interdependence between all parts of the Canadian social fabric. The treaty relationship is about independence as much as possible and mutual aid when it's needed. And my final teaching is about love. I love my home, my reserve, my First Nation. It's who I am. I love my treaty and everything about it, the good, the bad. It's my identity. In 1870, a chief gave good advice to the Queen. He said, "When we meet next summer, you must be prepared to tell us where you want your roads to pass and what lands you require. We believe what you tell us when you say in your land, the Indians have always been treated with clemency and justice, and we're not apprehensive for the future. But do not bring settlers and surveyors amongst us to measure and occupy our land until a clear understanding has been arrived at as to what our relations are to be in the time to come." And this is where we are in our relationship. Much like the Hoof clan, we've retreated from one another, and we have to decide if we can live together in a good way. Bamadsawin, Pamadsawin, Nodsawin, all of those good teachings that we can share with you, and you can share with us how your beautiful Constitution will help in that relationship. Chimigwech.
In gratitude and trust in God, we present our offerings and our paying rent contributions. Loving God, as our world hurtles towards a time of unraveling of the systems of domination, greed, and exploitation, you answer our deepest needs for belonging to you, to each other, and to all creation. Your kingdom of abundance and justice, where all creation is welcomed at the banquet table, claims our imaginations and our allegiance. Your spirit of joy and just generosity sustains us. And together we say, as a symbolic act of repentance and an expression of our desire for an equitable sharing of this land with First Nations, we commit to paying rent.
Please be seated. I draw your attention to the announcements in your bulletin. There are quite a few, particularly to one, Season for Commitment, November 10th. It's coming up before next Sunday. There's going to be pool and air hockey with James and Willie at 40 Birch Avenue, just by Summerhill subway station at the Harry Red Foster Drop-In Centre. Everybody's welcome to these events. So again, just to draw your attention to that in your bulletin. And a special congratulations to Jamie Groot, our alto, Jamie, stand up, our alto section lead in the choir, who was the third prize winner in the Canadian Opera Ensemble singing competition this past Thursday. So a way to go, Jamie. Rock